All right, so I'm at it again. I'm here at my setup bench. I've just finished working on this 1997 Fender American Deluxe jazz bass. These basses were made in a variety of sort of form factors with a variety of sort of appointments, but this particular version of the bass was made from about 95 till about 97. They have carbon rods next to the truss rod in the neck. They had lightweight tuners, slightly modified version of the regular Fender tuners. They had string through the body, as you can see here, as well as pretty amazing single pole pickups with an active system. I also like to note the sort of look of these instruments. These were amazing looking instruments that came in a bunch of colorways. This particular Sunburst with this tortoise guard I think is great. Obviously people have different tastes. I've sort of been thinking about this instrument and wanted to make a video about it because I think they're a really important part of sort of history of the bass. The 90s are pretty, I mean, you could say that the 80s were really important, that the 2000s were really important, that the 60s were important, but I think from a builder perspective, I think that the 90s are tremendously important. There are a lot of developments that happened really, you know, beyond the major builders, beyond Gibson and Fender, starting in the 60s. And you saw an explosion of smaller builders in the 80s, but it was really in the 90s where we started to see some pretty dramatic changes to what was happening in bass. You know, modern bass with the variety of options that we have really started then. We started to see aftermarket pickups, you know, beyond the major builders. You know, we had Bartolini, Seymour Duncan, EMG. Those are certainly a big piece of modifying instruments, and you see a lot of vintage instruments modified the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s. But then in the mid 90s, it became, instead of just simply modifying, this idea that we would buy less expensive instruments that had good bodies and good necks. You know, the advent of Warmoth, the sort of popularity of Warmoth, and the lower priced Squire and Mexican standard, you know, basses that Fender came out with themselves. But then also the explosion of builders like Sadowski really becoming a prominent part of, you know, part of our dialogue about bass. You know, those basses were in the hands of people like players like Will Lee, but the fact that people would have things like Federa and Sadowski, Mike Lowe, which started in the 90s. You know, these are builders and you know, modified, sort of modified versions of classics that really started in the 90s with their popularity. Anyways, in 1995, Fender refreshed their line of instruments. They refreshed the Strats and the Tellys, and their vintage line, which had been really the cornerstone of what made them so good after all the sort of uncertainty of the late 60s and 70s. But their bass line really, they really narrowed it down. They had you know, they had a bunch of different lines, but their American line made up of really just P basses and jazz basses. They started to have there was like a fretless P bass. The Roscoe Beck 5-string had been available for a couple of years, but Fender started making a 5-string jazz bass that was, they made a passive one, and then they also made a deluxe version. So this deluxe 4-string sort of, to me, represents sort of a turning point in bass and a turning point in Fender's history, because Fender started to incorporate new ideas in the same way that other sort of more progressive builders started to do. And to a greater or lesser extent, they are a big corporation. I'm not sponsored by them. I think they've made a lot of great products, and for how big they are, they do a great job. But I think this is like a perfect bass. As I said, it's got carbon rods, it's got these pickups, it's got this body shape, which is a slightly smaller body shape, sort of similar to those Sadowskis. Similar, not the same. Similar to what Fender had been doing in the 80s, but I think less dramatic. And, you know, well appointed. But this preamp is really where it's at. You know, these humbucking pickups are amazing. So, you know, in the neck position, I'm getting, you know, like a 51 P-bass style sound. In the back position, I'm no Jocko player, but really articulate, but still a really usable tone. And when you throw this preamp in there, so we've got this really honky sound with a little bass and a little mid, it really comes alive. I can actually roll the treble off and it really digs in. You might not be able to hear that because certainly you could hear my frets. These are amazing instruments. This instrument, it's 22 years old. It was built in 1997, and it really just needed a little bit of tweaking. One of the challenges that we have with older instruments as they age is that, you know, the frets become a little uneven, even if they're not worn. They are worn down just a little bit. So that means that, you know, tweaking the action at the nut is really super important. That's something that I do. So being able to easily fret that first fret, that's where we're building our our good action from. Certainly you want to make sure that the bridge is appropriate. You don't want it to be, you know, crazy off the fretboard, but ultimately you want to be able to fret these first at least 5 frets, but, you know, probably more like the first 7 frets pretty easily. And that's done at the nut. With a straight neck and good action at the nut, you can adjust the bridge a lot easier, and the changes aren't as dramatic. There's a lot of people that like to have a bowed neck, and that's something that they're comfortable with. I like to go with the straight neck, and this neck is super straight. You know, I've got a little phone video camera, so you can't see it, but you can trust me. That's, you know, there you go. The frets are great on this. These are steel strings and steel frets, so. Get a good high end off of this, and if I wanted to do some thumping and plucking, not going to go crazy with that. But it's important to know that your instrument can do these things. So for those of you that do your own setups, make sure that you're able to sort of make all the sounds that you think you want to make with your instrument. There's some that are great for fingerstyle, some that are great for thumping and plucking, as well as playing with the pick. So especially when you have a modern preamp like this, it's really important. Anyways, if you want to check out more of my work, you can check out my YouTube channel. You've obviously made it here. If you're watching this on social media, you can send me a message through either Instagram or Facebook, or you can go to my website at charlieshortmusic.com, and my email and phone number are right there. Set up an appointment. I'll set up your instrument. Thanks a lot, guys.